Graham Langford stands beneath the granite statue of his daughter in the pouring rain. The hush of the one-year memorial is broken when a thin girl in a sodden hoodie emerges from the shadows. Her voice barely rises above the patter of droplets as she approaches him. Graham Langford pressed his palm against the cool marble of his daughter's statue, rainwater tracing rivulets down the polished surface. He closed his eyes, willing the whisper he'd just heard to be a fragment of some harried dream, an echo of his own desperation. Instead, the chill of the evening and the weight of her empty absence pressed down on him more heavily than ever. He turned away, glancing at the wrought iron gate of the garden as the mysterious girl slipped back into the shadows. Every instinct he had, every ounce of control purchased by a lifetime of deals and boardroom triumphs, urged him to demand answers. Yet Graham only inhaled, letting the storm's roar drown out his racing thoughts. Finally, he strode toward the carriage house where his driver waited, face drawn tight and uncharacteristically silent. Inside the polished leather cabin, the world seemed to slow. The soft click of the door closing marked a boundary between public sorrow and private torment. Graham's reflection in the tinted glass showed hollows beneath steel-gray eyes that hadn't closed all night. He folded his hands over his lap, recalling the moment that changed everything. 2 years earlier, the estate's fire alarms had shrieked at 2:17 a.m. The inferno clawed its way through corridors of polished oak and Venetian chandeliers, feeding on luxury until it became a ravenous blaze. Graham, roused from his study, charged upstairs in a tailored tuxedo, smoke stinging his nostrils. He found Aubrey on the landing, delicate and sleeping, her pajamas singed at the hem. A final crack of timber sent him sprawling into darkness. When he woke, his lungs burned, and his world had narrowed to white walls and antiseptic air. Doctors hovered in masks, speaking in measured tones about severe burns, grafts, and complications. He searched for her. In vain. All that was left was ash in a steel box and a single fragment of gold-plated charm from her bracelet, retrieved from the smoldering rubble. Graham exhaled slowly as the car rolled past the gated entrance and onto the drive. The memory's sting eased only slightly. He clutched the sleeve of his jacket, fingers brushing the cufflink, a gift from Aubrey's Christmas 2 years before. It gleamed faintly, reminding him that love could survive even the most brutal silence. At the grand library doors he paused. Somewhere inside lay the closed case file, sealed on official orders and marked, "Accidental electrical fire, no further action." He had signed every paper, acquiesced to every statement. The world needed closure. He needed the truth. Tonight, though, nothing could stay closed. The girl in the rain had awakened something he thought long buried. The fierce insistence that no price, no grief, dollar sum could ever compensate for a daughter he still believed was out there, somewhere beyond the ashes. And Graham Langford never gave up on what he believed was worth fighting for. Graham Langford moved through the cavernous foyer of his estate's carriage house, footsteps soft on the woolen rug. The ornate sconce lights cast long, wavering shadows across portraits of ancestors who had built his fortune. Normally, such halls told stories of triumph. Now they felt haunted by questions with no answers. He paused before his private library door, hand hovering on the bronze doorknob, before steel resolves him. He must know more. Inside, the library was hushed, save for the distant tick of a grandfather clock. Walls lined with leather-bound tomes seemed to lean closer, as if listening. Graham flicked on the desk lamp, floodlight on mahogany spines and a single, sealed manila folder stamped, "Fire Investigation, Closed." He swiped it aside. Tonight he'd open it, but first, a distraction tugged at his mind. The girl in the garden. He crossed to the door and threw it open. Rain drummed against the windows, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of gray. He should have forgotten her, some desperate child playing tricks on a billionaire's nerves. Yet he couldn't. He had wealth to summon any resource, power to command any truth, but he lacked her detail. Aubrey's pajamas, the toy she'd clutched, the birthmark behind her ear. How could a perfect stranger know such intimate fragments? A soft shuffle in the shadowed entryway made him whirl around. There, inches from the threshold, crouched the girl. Raindrops fell from her curly hair, each bead catching the light like a tiny alert. She was thin, too thin, jeans soaked through and clinging to her legs. Her hoodie was black, the hood drawn tight, framing wide, dark eyes that held equal parts fear and resolve. Graham's voice came out steadier than he felt. "You came back," he said, advancing 3 careful steps. "You know my name. You know things you shouldn't. Who are you?" She lifted her chin. Under the brim of that sodden hood, her face glistened, eyelashes heavy with moisture, cheeks stained by rain. Her voice trembled but carried clear. "Imani." She paused, inhaled a ragged breath, and pressed on. "Aubrey wasn't supposed to die." Graham closed the distance. He could smell the rain's iron tang on her clothes and something else. Smoke or fear? Why me? Why now? Imani's lips quivered. She glanced toward the library, then back to him, eyes fierce. "I watched them pull her out of an ambulance. Not a city medic's rig, a black SUV. They wore uniforms, Mr. Langford, but not ours." He felt a pulse behind his temple, a heartbeat that thrummed louder than any engine in his fleet. "You're sure?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I was under that porch. I saw them." She lifted her hand, revealing trembling fingers. Clutched in her palm was the tiny melted charm, edges blackened, twisted into an unrecognizable shape. This fell off her bracelet. Silence settled between them like a gauzy curtain. The stately room, once a refuge of reason and order, now felt foreign. Graham looked down at the fragment. His breath hitched. Every memory he'd buried clawed its way back. Aubrey's laughter, the small pop of her bracelet clasp. The impossibility of it all thrust him forward, into a darkness he had long refused to face. He knelt before Imani, meeting her gaze levelly. "Show me everything," he said quietly. "I need you to tell me it all." Around them the rain fell harder, drumming a slow march toward truths they both now knew they had to uncover. Graham Langford sat heavily at the edge of his library desk, the melted fragment trembling in Imani's outstretched palm. The lamplight caught its warped contours, a twisted remnant of gold and plastic, barely wider than a thumbnail. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he traced the shape of what he once knew so well. "This was hers," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He reached out, fingertips hovering inches from the fragment before daring to touch it. The metal was cool, oddly comforting against his skin. "It's from Aubrey's bracelet," he said, voice low. "She never went anywhere without this charm." Imani watched him, her dark eyes bright with anticipation and fear. A distant thunder rolled through the night, as if echoing the tension in the room. Graham straightened, turning fully toward the girl. "How did you find this?" She swallowed hard, shifting on the damp floorboards. "After the fire, they cleaned up fast. She closed her eyes, drawing a breath that shook her small frame. "I went back to the ruins. The ground was still hot. I dug through the ashes until my fingers burned. Then I felt something hard, and I pulled it out." He raised an eyebrow. "You survived the fire?" Imani's gaze flicked away, shadowed by memories she wouldn't share yet. "I was there," she repeated, "hiding under the ambulance porch." Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her knees. "I saw them throw people into that SUV. I smelled smoke and fear." Graham nodded slowly, absorbing every nuance of her story. He leaned back, folding his arms over his chest. This charm belonged only to Aubrey Langford. No one else had one like it. He paused, his breath echoing in the hush of the library. "You're not lying." A shudder passed through Imani. Relief and terror swirled in her eyes. Graham set the fragment on the desk, next to the sealed folder marked "Fire Investigation Closed." He slid the folder toward himself. "Then we open this." As he snapped the seal, a memory surfaced unbidden. Aubrey, 6 years old, curled in his lap by the fireplace, her eyes shining with mischief as she offered that same charm first. "Don't lose this," she'd giggled. "It's magic." He remembered the warmth of her breath and the weight of that promise in her tiny hand. Now, the charred piece lay on polished wood, a testament to how promises could survive tragedy, if only in fragments. Graham tore open the file, scanning over yellowed pages and typed reports. Each line felt suddenly hollow. No foul play suspected. Electrical wiring malfunction. Case closed. He glanced back at Imani. The candlelight danced in her eyes. "You gave me more than this," he said quietly. "You gave me hope." Outside, the storm intensified, rain streaking the windows like tears. Graham rose, lifting the fragment and the file as if they were sacred relics. "We're not stopping until we find the truth," he vowed. Imani stood beside him, shoulders squared. The wind howled through the trees, but inside that grand library a different storm was gathering, one of reckoning, of secrets clawing their way into the light. And Graham Langford knew there was no turning back. Graham Langford sank into the high-backed leather chair behind his mahogany desk, the sealed fire investigation folder open before him. He set the melted charm beside his phone, as if stationing a sentinel over every conversation to come. The storm's echo through the large windows faded into the background as he tapped his office intercom. "Maria, patch me through to Jonathan Pierce." Moments later, the line clicked. Jonathan's voice, calm and practiced, crackled softly over the speaker. "Good evening, sir." Graham's knuckles whitened as he grasped the handset. "Jonathan," he said evenly, "I need you to pull every record you've got on the Langford estate fire 1 year ago. Emergency logs, ambulance dispatch, everything, and cross-check it against any unmarked vehicle movements." There was a pause on the other end, a subtle shift from routine deference to cautious attention. "Sir, the official report was closed. There are no discrepancies in the city files. Everything points to electrical malfunction." Graham inhaled, recalling Imani's unwavering claim. "I'm aware. There's new evidence. A witness. I need raw data." He tapped the folder's cover. "I want timestamps, raw call audio, CCTV footage, unedited. Channel it through the private server. I don't care about protocol." Jonathan hesitated, then replied, "Understood. It may take some time, but I'll have preliminary logs ready within the hour." Graham replaced the handset gently and leaned back, pressing his fingertips together in thought. Power and influence had always felt enough, contracts signed, boardrooms bowed. Yet now, for the first time, he felt the limitations of his empire. Protocol could be overturned, but buried truths required persistence, and someone with nothing to lose. He stood and approached his floor-to-ceiling window. Rain cascaded down the glass in ghostly rivulets, distorting the night lawn's iron fountain into a livid blur. Somewhere in that darkness, a girl named Imani was waiting, trusting him with her story. He straightened his shoulders. If Jonathan found nothing, he would turn to his private contacts, independent investigators, former special ops allies, cybersecurity experts. He would gather every resource at his disposal until the truth surfaced. The intercom chimed again. "Sir?" It was Maria's voice. "Your guest has arrived." Graham turned to the doorway. Standing in the entrance was Daphne Lee, his longtime security chief, her expression unreadable beneath sharp cheekbones and sleek, straight hair. She'd managed his personal protection detail for years, privy to every risk assessment and classified briefing. Her presence tonight signaled urgency. "Daphne," he greeted, voice steady. "Close the door." As the door clicked shut, Daphne stepped forward, her storm-dark coat dripping with residual rain. "Sir, I've just spoken with Pierce. He confirms the city has no record of any unmarked SUV or ambulance discrepancy, nothing beyond the official logs." Graham met her eyes. "Then we go off-book." Daphne's jaw tightened. "Understood, I'll assemble a team." Her words hung in the lamplit room like a solemn vow. Outside, thunder rumbled again, and Graham felt the world shift, his private life and public empire converging on a single point of conspiracy. He returned to the desk, the melted charm glinting under the lamp. "Find the truth," he murmured, more to himself than to Daphne. "No matter the cost." And with that, the gears of his personal investigation began to turn, fueled by grief, determination, and the fragile hope of a broken girl in a hoodie. Graham Langford poured steaming cocoa into 2 porcelain mugs, the rich scent swirling through the warm glow of his library. The storm's fury outside was a distant thunder now, its rage contained behind thick glass. He offered 1 mug to Imani, who accepted it with hands so small they nearly engulfed the delicate handle. They sat across from each other at a low marble table, bookshelves rising like silent sentinels in the lamplit hush. Imani stared into her cocoa as though it held answers. Graham watched her, his gaze softening. He'd expected defiance or deceit, yet here was a child trembling in truth. She took a tentative sip, then set the mug aside. "My mom said don't trust anyone," Imani began, voice low. "She taught me how to hide." She lifted her knees to her chest, hoodie sleeves stretching over her fingers. "When those uniforms showed up, I was barefoot under the ambulance porch. My blanket was stuck in the wheel well, so I couldn't run." Graham leaned forward. "The ambulance porch?" She nodded. It was cold and wet, but it felt safer than out there. Her eyes flicked to the window, where lightning sketched branches like skeletal hands. "I saw them come around the back, men in black jackets with no badges. They motioned to a stretcher, but they weren't paramedics." Her words were a whisper, but each shook the cathedral of his resolve. He pictured Aubrey, small and scared, swallowed by strangers in the dark. Imani continued, voice steadying. They loaded her onto a gurney. The uniformed men talked fast. One said, "Keep her alive until the lab's ready." I didn't know what lab. They carried her to a black SUV with no plates. The license was a blur. Graham's knuckles whitened around the mug. "Did you see faces?" Imani hesitated. "Not well. Masks, maybe. But one of them, he had a scar on his cheek." Her brow furrowed, like a sideways Z. A memory flickered, a surgeon's note in his daughter's charts. Dermal graft from unknown incident. He forced it aside. This wasn't about Aubrey's medical file. She swallowed. "After they drove off, I crawled out. I found Aubrey's charm when I stood up, right under the bumper. I don't know why I kept it." Her gaze met his, unwavering. "I knew someone would want to know." Silence wrapped them both. He traced the rim of his mug, tasting bitterness he couldn't dismiss with sugar. In Imani's story lay the chasm between official records and a hidden truth. Finally, Graham set down his mug. "Imani," he said gently, "you've done more than surviving. You've given me a lifeline." He offered her a reassuring smile. "I promise, I'll follow every lead, every shadow, until I bring her home." Rain tapped softly on the window pane as father and girl shared a silent pact. Together they would hunt secrets buried in darkness and reclaim a truth stolen by fire. The command center felt more like a war room than a segment of Graham Langford's vast estate. Low amber lights hummed across consoles, screens flickering with lines of code and rolling data. Daphne Lee stood at Graham's side, arms crossed, as he stared at a cascade of erased log entries blinking back at him. At a long hacker's bench, two analysts, dubbed Rook and Cipher, worked in tandem. Their fingers raced over illuminated keyboards, summoning fragments of digital footprints from servers thought pristine. Every recovered packet felt like exhuming a buried secret, each byte a whispered confession. Graham hovered near the main display. A stark message blinked in red, "Record not found." Beneath it, a string of garbled metadata hinted at deliberate deletion. He pressed his palm flat on the glassy surface, heart thudding. Aubrey's night, once sealed away as an accident, was now opening like a hidden vault. "Here," Rook murmured, leaning forward. A secondary console ignited with a directory of encrypted folders, one marked Project Helix, Confidential. Graham's breath caught. He recalled the name from a hushed board meeting months before, a shelved charity fronted by investors unknown. Now it was a pillar supporting something far darker. Cipher tapped a command. Within seconds, a pixelated image floated on the screen, the melted charm, frozen in a JPEG buried deep in a proprietary database. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a time-stamped proof of Amani's story, snapped by a device in a server run by Helix. Graham's throat tightened. He remembered Aubrey's curious giggle as she held that charm to the light, likening it to a tiny galaxy. That galaxy had been recorded, catalogued by people who saw her not as a child, but as data. "You're telling me they stored her like a specimen," he said, voice hollow. Daphne's gaze hardened. "We also pulled registration details for Helix. No physical address, shell company officers funded by offshore accounts. They're using it to funnel everything: research grants, medical trials, private security contracts." A low growl of thunder shook the windows. Graham's grief flared into resolve. "Show me everything, every file, every transfer." The analysts nodded, launching a deeper probe. On screen, spreadsheets materialized. Child patients east of here, lab requisition codes, anonymized vital sign logs. Each row was a hidden life. Each column a sanctioned experiment. Imani watched in silence from the corner, clutching her hoodie. Her face, lit by the monitors, held both horror and fierce determination. In that moment, she and Graham were bound by something stronger than blood, a mission to unearth every shadow that had touched Aubrey. Hours passed in a blur of discover and disbelief. By dawn, they'd reconstructed the night of the fire in digital fragments. The unmarked ambulance ride, the diverted GPS coordinates, the transfer into a black SUV registered to a Helix front. Graham exhaled, leaning back. As the first pale light of morning seeped through the blinds, he traced the melted charm's outline on the screen. It was no longer a broken trinket, but a beacon, guiding them toward a conspiracy that reached far beyond his estate. He turned to Imani, voice quiet but unwavering. "We have our evidence. Now we go after the people who hid it." Outside, storm clouds broke to reveal an uncertain sky, still gray, but edged with the promise of truth, lighting the horizon. Graham Langford sat behind the massive conference table in his corporate boardroom, the same room where he had once toasted the founding of Helix Technologies. The morning sun sliced through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the quiet. He stared at the spreadsheets on the polished wood, data points now stained by the knowledge of children lost and lives commodified. A memory drifted in. 3 years earlier, he had locked arms with pioneering researchers at Helix, driven by the notion that artificial skin grafts and neurological interfaces could leap from theory to practical healing. In those early meetings, he'd listened to passionate presentations, watched robotics demos, and felt the thrill of altering the future of medicine. Investors huddled around gleaming prototypes, proclaiming cures for paralysis and revolutionary burn therapies. Graham had envisioned a world where no child would wake scarred or abandoned. He remembered Dr. Marlowe's voice, soft-spoken, almost poetic, promising breakthroughs that would redeem human fragility. "We're on the cusp," she'd said, her eyes bright. "Your support will take us from concept to clinical trials." Graham, eager to honor his daughter's memory, had poured millions into Helix's labs, believing philanthropy could marry profit and conscience. He'd signed the paperwork with trembling hands, sealing his commitment to something greater than oil fields and boardroom battles. But in the years since, Helix's shutters shifted. Clinical partners slipped away or vanished. Research grants dissolved into slush funds. Security protocols tightened around corridors he'd helped build. He'd heard whispers, late-night rumors, of trials run without oversight, of children never returning home. He'd turned a blind eye, telling himself that success required risk, that frontier science always danced on the edge of moral compromise. A soft chime broke his reverie. Daphne stood at the back door, arms folded, bearing the morning's brief. Graham looked up, face drained of color. "You found more?" he asked. She nodded, placing a tablet on the table. The screen glowed with a redacted memorandum from Helix's internal archives, a memo from Dr. Marlowe herself, instructing field agents to expedite high-value specimens through non-public channels. Beneath that, shipping logs listed Project Gem, Project Orion, and Project Aurora, code names that matched no sanctioned trials. He pressed his fingertips together, the weight of betrayal settling like concrete in his chest. "I funded this," he whispered. "I made this possible." Imani, seated nearby on a leather loveseat, watched him with solemn eyes. She had come to understand that grief could be both a lantern and a blindfold. Graham had lit the path to these labs, but now that glow guided him into darkness. He rose and walked to the window, palms against the cool glass. The city skyline shimmered at dawn, its promise of renewal tainted by his own hubris. Each tower reflected back his remorse. He whispered to the empty streets below, "I will fix this." Turning, Graham met Imani's gaze. The girl who once trembled under that porch now stood steady, her resolve unshaken. Together, they had unearthed Helix's broken promises. Now they would confront the architects of its deceit. The echoes of his past had become the drumbeat of his mission, and with every step forward, he carried the weight of both his mistakes and his undying hope. Wind-raked clouds scudded across the estate's stone facade as dawn broke, but inside the library, warmth still clung to the air from last night's vigil. Graham Langford stood by the hearth, staring at embers long cooled. Across the room, Imani pressed her soaked hoodie tighter, tracing a scuff on the leather armchair with restless fingers. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Graham turned, voice soft. "Tell me about before the fire," he said, "before you came here." Imani's gaze drifted to the rows of books, their gilded titles glinting like silent witnesses. She inhaled, the memory surfacing in tremors. "I was 8 when they took me from my mom." Her words were brittle as twigs. "She couldn't feed me. CPS said she was unfit. I thought she was sick, but it was just poverty." She paused, eyes distant. Foster homes smelled like bleach and regret. Some families tried, but others, a shadow crossed her face. "They let me sleep in closets. I learned to make myself small. I learned to scream in my head so no one would find me." Graham's heart clenched, but he stayed silent, letting her pain fill the room. The hush was broken only by the slow drip of a loose gutter outside. "I ran when I was 10, Imani continued. "I ran to stay alive." Her voice hardened. "I learned where to find free meals, church kitchens, Soup lines. I learned which back alleys had loose boards for shelter. I learned how to vanish. She clenched her jaw. No one looked for me. I was just another statistic. Graham felt the ache of her loneliness, one he knew all too well. A father's absence in the crowd at memorials, a child's face fading from every photo. He crossed to her, kneeling at her feet. "You survived on your own," he said quietly. "That takes more courage than most people ever know." Imani's eyes flicked to him, skepticism fighting gratitude. "You say that now," she whispered. "But after the fire, I thought maybe someone would care." She shook her head, tears glistening. "No one did, until tonight." He reached out, covering her small hand with his. "I care," he said simply. "I believe you." A flutter of something like hope touched Imani's features. She drew a shaky breath, releasing years of pent-up fear. Outside, the first rays of sun pierced the windows. The library's heavy drapes rustled, revealing a sky unburdened by storm. Imani stood, pulling her hoodie down over Graham's hand. "Then let's finish this," she said, voice steadier. "Find out who did this to Aubrey. And to me." He rose too, respect and compassion mingling in his gaze. In that shared resolve, the billionaire and the runaway found a fragile kinship. Two souls, once abandoned, now united by grief and guided by the promise that no act of kindness, no matter how long delayed, went unnoticed. Together they crossed the threshold into the hallway, shoulders square against the past's shadows, ready to step into whatever darkness lay ahead. A slate-gray dawn chased away the library's lingering glow as Graham Langford and Imani climbed into the matte black SUV waiting at the carriage house. Daphne Lee slipped into the driver's seat, hand steady on the wheel. The estate gate swung closed behind them, sealing off the last vestiges of comfort. Imani pressed her forehead against the tinted window, watching mist swirl over manicured lawns. Every mile toward the rural retreat felt like stepping deeper into a labyrinth, one where the walls were built from corporate secrets and silent laboratories. Graham sat beside her, eyes fixed on the GPS coordinates, pulsing on the dashboard. He could feel her unease. He reached over and brushed a stray curl from her brow. "We're close," he said, voice low. "Stay with me." She nodded, tracing patterns on the fogged glass. The countryside rolled by in muted greens and browns, ancient oaks arching over narrow roads. Soon the SUV ground to a halt at the edge of a gravel drive. Ahead, half hidden behind cedars, stood the Helix Retreat, a cluster of low-slung buildings with mirrored windows and razor-wire fencing. No sign announced its purpose, only an unmarked gate guarded by two uniformed sentries. Graham exhaled, stepping out into the damp air. His tailored coat did little against the chill, but he welcomed the cold clarity. Daphne killed the engine. Imani curled her fingers around the melted charm in her pocket, her silent talisman in a world that still doubted her truth. Daphne approached the guards first, ID badge in hand. "Director Langford requests immediate access," she said crisply. The guards exchanged a look, then one nodded and lifted the chain barrier. Graham and Imani followed, crossing the threshold into Helix territory. Inside, polished corridors branched like arteries, gleaming under fluorescent lights. They passed labs sealed behind biometric scanners and conference rooms lined with frosted glass. Daphne led them to a side door marked Restricted, Staff Only. On the other side, a narrow stairwell descended into near-total darkness. A hushed voice greeted them at the bottom. "You shouldn't be here." Daphne's flashlight revealed Daphne's former lab supervisor, Dr. Marlowe's assistant, codenamed Ghost. He wore rumpled scrubs and a haunted expression. "I have 10 minutes," he whispered, "before they call security." Imani's heart pounded as Ghost slid a data drive across a metal table. "These are patient logs and staff reports. Everything," he hissed. but you can't stay." Daphne seized the drive. "Thank you," Graham said softly. "We'll protect you." A distant alarm sang through the facility. The exit door slammed shut as red lights bathed the hall. Ghost vanished into the shadows. Daphne grabbed Graham's arm. "Move, now!" They sprinted uphill through winding corridors, past locked doors and curtained windows. Footsteps thundered behind them, security in black uniforms closing in. Imani's breath came in sharp bursts. Graham's coat snagged on a railing, but he tore free, determined. They burst through the main entrance into the drizzle outside. Daphne jammed the USB drive into her jacket and yanked open the SUV door. "Get in!" Imani dove into the back seat. Graham climbed in beside her just as a pair of guards emerged from the glass facade, weapons drawn. Daphne hit the accelerator, tires spinning on wet gravel as they roared away. In the rearview mirror, the retreat's perimeter blurred into the mist. Daphne's knuckles drummed on the steering wheel. Graham exhaled, relief and resolve mingling. Imani clutched the data drive like a lifeline. Behind them, the fortress faded into the dawn. Ahead, the secrets of Project Helix waited to be unearthed, if they could stay one step ahead of the hunters closing in. The SUV's headlights carved twin beams through a thicket of pines as Daphne navigated a narrow service road. The data drive lay heavy in her coat pocket, evidence that could ignite an investigation or paint a target on all their backs. In the back seat, Imani peered through the rain-streaked window at the forest, every shadow a potential threat. Graham watched her, heart tight with both pride and fear. This child had become his compass through darkness. They arrived at a clearing where a battered camper van stood half-hidden among saplings. A single lantern glowed by the door. Outside, two figures waited, cloaked in hoodies against the chill. One was Daphne's old colleague, Callum Ryas, an ex-Marine turned private security specialist. The other was Daphne's secret source, known only as Maribel, who'd whispered rumors of children dying in orphaned hallways. Maribel's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but bright with conviction. She stepped forward, voice low. "You made it." Behind her, the wind rustled the canopy like whispered warnings. "What you have, it changes everything." Graham extended a hand for the drive. He touched the USB's USB cover, hesitating for a fraction before slipping it into his pocket. "Tell us what you know," he urged. Maribel led them inside. The van's cramped interior smelled of damp blankets and stale coffee. Charts and maps covered the walls, annotated in frantic red ink. Site 12B, unmarked convoys, children transferred at night. A small table held a battered laptop, its screen flickering. She tapped a folder marked Operatives Logs. "Helix isn't just running tests. They're trafficking kids between facilities," Maribel whispered, eyes darting to the cracked window. "Some never come out." She paused, swallowing. "I recorded a transfer last month at a remote airstrip. 3 children, sedated, names listed in the vault you accessed, code names only. No parent ever knew." Imani pressed closer to Graham, voice trembling. "Were there survivors?" Maribel shook her head. "One. She was hidden, same as you. She escaped into the woods, but ended up in foster care with no memory of her past." Her gaze locked on Imani's. "That's how I found you." A sudden rustle outside made them all freeze. Callum ducked to the floor, whispering, "Heat signatures. 2 approaching." Daphne snapped off the lantern, plunging them into semi-darkness. Rain pattered on the roof like distant gunfire. Graham placed a hand on Imani's shoulder, voice steady. "Stay calm. We leave through the back." He flicked on a miniature tactical light under the table, its red beam guiding them toward a rear hatch. They filed out one by one, Imani last, carrying the melted charm clutched against her chest. Graham covered her path with a protective arm as Maribel led them through a narrow opening between trees. Branches clawed at their clothes. The forest swallowed their footprints. Behind them, the camper van's lantern blinked out as headlights tore through the night. But Graham and Imani did not look back. Ahead, the woods promised safety for now. And more importantly, the next clue on their hunt to save innocent lives and reclaim his daughter's stolen truth. By mid-morning, Graham, Imani, Daphne, and Callum had retreated to a nondescript townhouse on the outskirts of the city. An unmarked safe house rented through shell corporations, its walls silent except for the soft hum of a generator. Inside, the mood was taut. Monitors displayed the harvested logs from the USB drive, and laptops tracked digital footprints of known Helix operatives. Graham stood before a wall of screens, tapping through drone footage captured by Maribel's old contacts. A small commercial quadcopter drifted past the safe house 2 nights ago, its lens trained on the front window. On another feed, a black SUV with tinted windows prowled the curb outside a cafe Graham had visited. Daphne frowned as she watched the circle of tail vehicles near the townhouse's block. Imani lingered by the window, pressing her forehead against the glass. Rain had returned, leaving the street slick and reflective. "They're everywhere," she whispered. The reflection of her hoodie-clad figure layered over the drifting sedan outside, a reminder that her life would never be private again. Graham moved to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're scared," he said, voice quiet. "When you shine a light on something rotten, it scrambles the insects." He offered her a small smile, but felt the weight of every watched moment. Daphne held up a tablet. "We've isolated 3 surveillance drones, 2 unmarked sedans, and apparently a network of traffic cams pinging their location every 15 minutes. They're mapping our patterns." She tapped a finger against her temple. "We need to confuse their feeds." Callum stepped forward. "I've got thermal emitters and signal scramblers ready. We can set decoy hotspots around the perimeter, draw their eyes away." He glanced at Imani. "You up for a field test?" The girl nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "Show me." In the back room, they arranged 3 improvised decoy packages, old power generators rigged to emit heat signatures, parked on side streets a few blocks away. Callum connected the scrambler to a portable battery pack. "These will hide our real signal for about 30 minutes, long enough to slip away." Graham studied the plan, then hesitated. "And Imani?" "She'll plant them," replied Daphne. "Her size and speed make her the perfect courier." Imani's expression was resolute. "Let me do it." Graham placed a hand gently under her chin, locking eyes. "Be safe." She offered a firm nod. Within minutes, she was out the back door, slipping into the rain and shadowed streets. Inside, the team watched live thermal mapping. 3 red hotspots blinking into existence, one by one, on a digital city grid. The real signal at the safe house dimmed. "Now," Graham said, his voice a low command. "We move." As Daphne and Callum dispersed through a secret exit behind the chimney, Graham gathered his coat and phone. He paused at the doorframe, glancing back at the array of blinking consoles, evidence of the invisible war he'd waged against a faceless enemy. Outside, thunder rumbled. In the fractured glow of street lamps, Graham vanished into the night. Every step forward meant deeper risk, but he no longer feared watched eyes. He had Imani's trust, a decoy network in place, and a conviction burning brighter than any drone spotlight. Because to reclaim his daughter's truth, he would outpace the watchers, one shadow at a time. Graham Langford's rented SUV carved a hairpin turn up the mist-shrouded mountain road, headlights slicing through the damp dawn. Each twist felt like a narrowing noose. Higher they climbed, the more remote and fortified the landscape became. Beside him, Imani clutched the melted charm in one hand and the slimmed-down USB drive in the other, her knuckles white with anticipation. At the summit, a yawning steel door set into the granite cliff face stood sentinel, its surface pitted by wind and time. Above it, the faded logo of Project Helix, a double helix bisected by a serpent, was half erased by rust. Daphne and Callum had arranged for formidable cover, a forest fire crew's cover story, a maintenance crew's uniforms, even an unmarked forestry truck parked at the base road. This was their only way in. Graham eased the SUV to a halt. He felt the tremor of adrenaline in his limbs and glanced at Imani. "This is it," he whispered. She nodded, eyes bright with resolve. Daphne led the way, slipping on a hard hat and vest. Callum followed, his thermal scanner humming. Graham retrieved a small biometric keycard issued by his own foundation, engraved with Aubrey's name, a relic from the earliest days of Helix funding. It had been the only genuine access token he could locate. They crossed the threshold. Inside, a vast concrete corridor stretched into shadow, lit by emergency strips that glowed faintly green. Silence reigned. No hum of air handlers, no distant clatter of machinery. The air smelled of damp stone and something colder, clinical. Graham's pulse throbbed as he swiped the card against the scanner. A soft click echoed, and the vault door inched open. Beyond it lay a chamber lined with filing cabinets, biometric safes, and sealed cryogenic pods. Hundreds of dossiers hung neatly on rails, black portfolios stamped with code names: Gem, Orion, Aurora, and dozens more. He stepped in, heart hammering. Each folder represented a child, whose life had been summoned into this subterranean archive. He brushed his fingers across the nearest cabinet, the metal cold under his touch. Callum and Daphne flanked him, weapons drawn but lowered. This was discovery, not confrontation. Imani moved toward a glass-encased terminal at the far end. With trembling fingers, she inserted the USB drive. The screen flared to life, scrolling through file after file: medical scans, dosage logs, transport manifests. Her eyes widened at Aubrey's own entry, code name Gem, birth date matching her daughter's, a photograph pixel blurred but unmistakable. Graham's breath caught. He knelt beside Imani, voice tight. "See her there?" She nodded, tears brimming. They called her Gem because she was their prize. He straightened, gaze sweeping the vault. Rows of sealed pods stood sentinel, frost coating their glass lids. Inside, small forms lay motionless, some sedated, others mere embers of memory. Each represented a life stolen for experiments. Daphne thumbed through a portfolio labeled Project Helix Annex, pulling out a sheet stamped Destroy after 30 days. She studied the official signature, Dr. Marlowe's. They planned to erase everything. A tremor of righteous fury coursed through Graham. He pocketed the drive and turned to Imani. "We found the heart of it. Now we expose it." Around them, the vault's hush held its breath, as though awaiting a verdict. In the dim glow, father and daughter stood united, bearers of truth in a place built on silence. And Graham Langford vowed to shatter every lock, every secret, until the world knew what he and Imani had seen in the Vault of Shadows. The dawn light that filtered through the vault's entry glistened on metal surfaces like false hope. Graham Langford stood in the center of the chamber, heart pounding in his ears, as Imani scrolled through the digital dossiers. Each folder opened to reveal rows of clinical data, blood reports, dosage schedules, vital sign graphs. But the final files, death certificates stamped cause, experimental complication, wrenched at their guts. Imani's voice trembled. They killed them. She pointed to a scanned page. A child's name, redacted except for a brittle signature. Approved by Dr. Marlowe. Below, notes in neat script recorded an untested drug's lethal reaction. 23 kids, she whispered, tears tracing rivulets down her cheeks, all under 10. Graham closed his eyes, vision blurring with grief he couldn't name. He had lost Aubrey, and here lay proof it wasn't an accident. He flicked to her dossier. Gem, Aubrey Langford, DOB 04-12-2013. A photograph, a blurred snapshot of Aubrey's bright eyes, hovered above columns of physiological readings. The final entry, transferred to unknown facility, 08-15-23. The date of the fire. How could they? Graham murmured, voice cracking. He sank to one knee beside Imani, gently closing the dossier like a sacred tome. They trafficked her like cattle, he said between clenched teeth. They stole her. Imani knelt too, placing her hand over his. They lied, she said softly. They lied to us both. Her tilt of the head echoed all the children whose innocence had been bargained away. Daphne and Callum gathered around a holographic map projected from a wrist device. Red pins flickered at dozens of Helix-affiliated locations, research labs, private clinics, secure shipping depots. We have everything, Daphne said. This data, death logs, transfer manifests, can indict them. Callum's eyes were hard. We need to get it out to prosecutors, journalists, the world. But first, we secure physical evidence. He pointed to the frost-covered cryonic pods. Those children. If any are still alive, we rescue them first. Graham rose, a quiet fury igniting behind his grief-blurred gaze. He stepped to the nearest pod, pressing a gloved hand to the glass. Inside, a child lay curled in slumber, connected to sensors that still blinked with life. You saved my life in Berlin, he whispered, not to her, but to the memory of what real courage meant. Now I'll save yours. Imani stood beside him, small but unyielding. Together, father and daughter, bonded by love and sacrifice, regained their footing in a world of lies. With evidence clenched like a torch, they would set the record ablaze, bring the hidden horrors to light, and deliver justice for every lost child. Above them, the vault's silent vaulting ceiling seemed to bow in acknowledgement. The truth had finally broken free. Graham Langford watched the morning headlines cascade across his private newsroom monitors, each one a fresh betrayal. Energy tycoon unhinged, fabricated conspiracy. Langford's rescue mission a publicity stunt. Even the networks he'd once bankrolled shrugged off his name in favor of clip reel. Footage of Imani's rain-soaked entrance at the memorial. He sank into the plush leather chair behind his broadcasting console, chest tight, as though gripped by invisible claws. The vault's evidence had ignited a physical rescue, but now the corporate syndicate struck back where he was most vulnerable, his reputation. A dozen PR firms, hired years ago to polish his public image, were now silent. His spokespeople vanished from press briefings, his assets probed by opportunistic regulators. Imani sat beside him, shoulders squared even as she tapped through social media streams. She scrolled past smears accusing her of lying, labels branding her the hoodie phantom. Her dark eyes flickered with anger, defiance tempered by the child's knowledge that the world often believed the loudest lie first. Daphne entered with a tablet in hand. They're mobilizing damage control, she said, voice grim. Helix front groups are issuing statements. Langford's vendetta risks medical breakthroughs. They've got senators on conference calls calling for investigations into your foundation. Graham's jaw clenched. He looked at Imani, searching her face for hope in the swirling chaos. "They'll drown out the truth," he whispered. Imani set her phone aside, linking her small hand through his. "Then we make it impossible to ignore." Her voice was soft but steel-edged. "Show them the children. Let their voices be louder than any corporation's spin." Graham inhaled, feeling a spark of the old fire, the same thrill that had once driven him to fund Helix's promise of healing. Now that promise lay shattered. Yet from the shards a new conviction rose. Truth would not be buried beneath press releases and pundits. He stood and swept his gaze across the room, past the walls lined with trophies of wealth and power. They felt hollow now, monuments to a man who'd believed in progress without accountability. He tapped a button on the console. A live feed link popped up. Langford Press Conference, rolling in 5 minutes. Within moments, journalists and activists crowded into the estate's grand atrium, cameras swiveling toward the empty podium. Graham adjusted his cufflinks, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. Imani stood at his side, clutching the melted charm in one hand and a sheaf of printed dossiers in the other. When he stepped up to the microphone, the flashbulbs stuttered like lightning strikes. His voice, calm and resonant, carried across the hushed crowd. "Today I present to you undeniable proof of Project Helix's crimes. Not speculation, but the faces and files of children who paid the ultimate price." He gestured behind him, and a projection of cryogenic pod footage filled the screen, a silent row of drifting figures. Gasps rippled through the audience. Imani's gaze met his, a quiet affirmation that they were breaking through the storm of lies. "Let no corporate statement obscure their suffering," Graham continued. "Let no senator's denial overshadow their voices. We will not rest until every child is free, every truth told, and every guilty party held to account." As cameras rolled and the world watched, the storm of slander began to dissipate beneath the deluge of revelation. And in that moment, father and daughter stood firm, beacons of light cutting through the darkest cloud. Night fell like a shroud as Graham Langford, Imani, Daphne, and Callum crept through the overgrown service tunnel that led beneath the mountain. Their lanterns cast wavering halos on damp stone walls until the passage opened into a vast subterranean complex. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, revealing rows of cryogenic cells and observation booths, an antiseptic cathedral of suffering. Imani's breath caught as she stepped forward. Each pod held a child in suspended sleep, chest rising and falling beneath thin blankets. The air was frigid, every exhale crystallizing into mist. She pressed her palm to the glass of the nearest cell. Inside lay a small figure swaddled in Aubrey's quilt, its pastel stars dulled by frost. Her heart thundered with the shock of recognition. "Aubrey," she whispered, voice cracking. Graham stood just behind her, jaw clenched. He peered at data terminals along the wall. Monitors tracked vital signs, dosage schedules, stimulus logs. Each screen showed children's names replaced by codes, rows of numbers in place of childhood. On one, he saw Gem blinking next to a heart rate spike. Every pixel spoke of calculated manipulation, of human lives reduced to variables. From a shadowed corner, Daphne signaled them forward. "They're all here," she murmured. "Dozens of children, some stable, some critical." A low hum from the ventilation system pulsed like a ticking clock. "We've got to move fast." Callum knelt beside a panel, disabling the magnetic locks with a soft click. Cells hissed open one by one, releasing hibernating forms into arms that trembled with relief. Imani guided the groggy children past the waiting team, covering them with woolen wraps from her pack. Some opened glassy eyes, confusion mingled with fear, until Imani crouched before them and whispered, "You're safe." Graham spotted a still and silent pod at the far end, no pulse reading on its monitor. He ran, chest pounding. Inside lay a child no older than 6, curled motionless. Carefully, he slid off the lid and cradled her in his arms. Her skin was cold as marble. Despair flickered through Graham's mind, another casualty born of corporate cruelty. Yet as he gently warmed her, he noticed faint signs of life on the portable scanner Daphne handed him. A weak heartbeat pulsed under his fingers. Imani knelt beside her, tears glistening on her lashes. She brushed a kiss across the child's forehead. "Hold on," she whispered. "We're getting you out." A distant alarm began to wail. Security breach protocols triggered. Daphne's eyes met Graham's. "We have 30 seconds." He scooped the child into his arms and sprinted toward the exit. Callum carried 2 more. Imani gathered survivors in her arms, cradling them like fragile treasures. Behind them, pods continued to unlock, a flood of rescued lives breaking free from the heart of darkness. They burst into the tunnel as red lights sputtered above. Daphne slammed the heavy door shut, the mechanism sealing with a final clap. In the pitch black, Graham's arms trembled with exhaustion and triumph. Imani's persistence had led them here, and together they had saved the innocent from a nightmare they never deserved. Outside, thunder rumbled through the mountains, echoing the pulse of every rescued heartbeat. In the darkness, hope had been reborn. The mountain night air slammed into Graham Langford's lungs as he and his team spilled out of the service tunnel, small forms bundled in blankets pressed to their chests. Rain had returned in torrents, fat drops plinking on leaves, and the rough stone door they'd sealed behind them. Behind that barrier, alarms still blared, proof their intrusion had been discovered. Imani led the way down the muddy slope, cradling a groggy boy no older than 7. His eyelids fluttered as he drifted between fear and the safety of her arms. The wind whipped her hoodie around her, but she held him close, murmuring soothing words. "You're with me. You're safe now." Graham followed, carrying the cold but living girl, Aubrey, against his chest. Every step felt surreal. First, terror, then triumph. Now, the raw urgency to escape. His tailored coat was soaked. His cufflinks gleamed like tears in the flashlight beam, but he scarcely noticed. All that mattered was the gentle rise of Aubrey's chest, a promise of life restored. Callum and Daphne fanned out, weapons drawn, scanning the gloom for black uniformed guards. Flashlights stabbed into the dark, revealing twisted roots and slippery rocks. Daphne's voice crackled softly over their comms. "Command, urgent evac needed. Helicopter LZ secure at Grid 5. Graham pressed forward. A jagged cliff edge plunged into blackness to his left. To his right, the forest pressed in like snaring vines. Every breath he took tasted of damp earth and hope. Ahead, a faint orange glow marked the clearing where a single military helicopter hovered, a halo of bright light against the storm's dark canvas. As they approached, rotor wash battered them, screens of rain driving sideways. Callum bundled 2 more children into the stretcher net. A mechanic waved them aboard, snapping the net to hooks beneath the skids. Imani climbed up last, steady even as the wind roared around her. She looked back once, eyes locking with Graham's. "Thank you," she whispered. Graham turned to slowly lift Aubrey into the net, fingers trembling at the miracle of her warmth. A sob of relief tore from his throat as he secured her, brushing damp hair from her forehead, and seeing, at last, the small curve of Aubrey's lips in sleep. He felt her stir, felt a spark of recognition, or perhaps the echo of a memory he'd imagined. Then he climbed in himself, positioning under the heavy tarp that shielded the rescued children from the elements. The mechanic shouted over the rotors, "Hold on!" The helicopter lifted, jolting as it broke free of the trees. Rain pelted the windshield, lightning forked overhead. Graham pressed his forehead against the netting, heart pounding with gratitude and unspent terror. Below, the mountain receded. Behind, the Helix facility's lights flickered like dying embers. Ahead, the sky cracked open with possibility. And in Graham's arms, his daughter, his Aubrey, slept on. The grand atrium of Langford Manor had been transformed into a hall of reckoning. Rows of seats filled with press, activists, and human rights observers faced a broad marble dais. Behind it, a sweeping screen displayed images of cryogenic pods and data charts, the undeniable proof of Project Helix's atrocities. Graham Langford stepped to the microphone, his tailored jacket still damp from the mountain rain. Beside him, Imani gripped the melted charm in one hand and Aubrey's quilt in the other. In that moment, neither billionaire nor abandoned child stood alone. They were united as heralds of truth. He cleared his throat. Today, I stand before you not as an oil tycoon, but as a father who failed his daughter. His voice wavered, then strengthened. I funded a project I believed would save lives. Instead, it nearly destroyed them. Flashing behind him were dossiers stamped Gem, Orion, Aurora, each child a story of lost innocence. A hush fell. Cameras whirred. Graham continued, each word measured. These children were treated as test subjects, their lives archived and erased in secret labs. The fire that took Aubrey was no accident. It was a smokescreen to cover a monstrous enterprise. At his signal, the screen split to live feeds of survivors now seated in front-row chairs, some stiff in borrowed coats, others trembling. A young girl, no older than Aubrey had been, stood unsteadily. Tears glistened as she took the microphone. They called me Project Orion. They told me I was special, but I was afraid. Her voice cracked. He saved me. She gestured toward Graham. Imani stepped forward, soft-spoken but resolute. I was the witness no one believed, Imani Johnson. She held up the charm. This tells my story, our story. And now the world knows. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Journalists pounded their notebooks. Live broadcasts rippled across screens in every time zone. Graham watched Imani's back straighten with pride, then turned back to the audience. Helix executives have been detained, he announced. Senators have opened hearings, and nonprofits are mobilizing to reunite survivors with families. This platform is just the beginning. A ripple of applause, hesitant, then surging into a standing ovation. Tears brimmed in Graham's eyes as Imani slid the charm into his palm. He closed his fingers over it and looked skyward, imagining Aubrey's bright smile. Afterward, as cameras swirled, Daphne and Callum guided the survivors outside into waiting vans and ambulances. Graham knelt beside the girl who'd spoken, Project Orion, and brushed a damp curl from her forehead. You're safe now, he whispered. Imani slipped her arm through his. Together, they watched the survivors depart, each child stepping toward a life reclaimed. In that hall of judgment, the billionaire had been unmasked, not as a magnate, but as a man transformed by grief, guilt, and undying love. And the world watched as he vowed to make their future brighter than any fortune he'd ever amassed. The morning sun warmed the courtyard of the city's children's hospital as families gathered on the brick-paved circle. Graham Langford stood off to the side, watching through steel-framed windows as ambulances wheeled in survivors bundled in blankets. The air carried the brittle tang of antiseptic and the sweeter scent of spring blossoms from the nearby gardens. Inside, nurses guided a trembling boy toward a reunion. A woman knelt beside him, arms open, tears shining as she whispered his secret name. The boy hesitated, then collapsed into her embrace, sobbing with relief. Graham's throat tightened. He remembered every moment of losing Aubrey to an empty room. He turned to Imani, who clutched Aubrey's pastel quilt in her arms. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, eyes bright. Together they stepped into the bustle, weaving through wheelchairs and gurneys, offering nods and smiles of reassurance. In the pediatric wing, they found room 312, a clean suite with balloons tied to the bedpost. A plaque on the door read, "Welcome home, Lily." Inside, a young girl sat upright, clutching a teddy bear, face pale but eyes wide with wonder. Outside the glass panel, her mother hovered, uncertain and stiff. Graham placed a hand on Imani's shoulder. "After you," he murmured. Imani took a steadying breath and knocked lightly. The girl inside turned, curiosity and fear mingling in her gaze. Imani opened the door, holding out the quilt. "Hi," Imani whispered. "I'm Imani, and this was mine. Now it's yours." She draped the quilt gently over the girl's shoulders. The child's lips trembled as she felt the soft fabric. Her mother hurried forward, wrapping her arms around both girls. Tears spilled as they hugged, the quilt bridging two lives once frayed by tragedy. Graham watched the reunion, feeling a warmth spread through him. He saw in that embrace the life he'd feared lost forever, the small fingers that clutched his own, the bright laugh that once filled empty rooms. He closed his eyes, picturing Aubrey's smile as she opened that same quilt on some future night, safe and loved. Behind him, a nurse summoned Graham for a final meeting. He left Imani with the reunited families and walked down the corridor lined with pastel murals. In the conference room, board members and child welfare advocates waited, forming a semicircle around a table strewn with blueprints for the Langford Imani Youth Shelter. He cleared his throat. "This building will open next month," he announced, voice steady. "It will offer food, counseling, and a refuge for kids like Imani, children who deserve more than statistics and shadows." He paused, swallowing the weight of his vow. "And every room will have a copy of this quilt." He held up the pastel swirls. "So they know they belong." Back in the hallway, Imani emerged, slipping her arm through Graham's. "They're all smiling," she said, voice bright. He nodded, lifting her hand to his cheek. "Because you showed them kindness," he replied, "and because we never gave up." They walked out into the sunlit courtyard together, father and daughter, survivor and champion, carrying hope in a quilt of pastel stars and the promise of new beginnings. Sunlight slanted through the rotunda's stained glass dome as senators, legal counsel, and human rights observers filled the marble chamber. Graham Langford sat at a long oak table, his tailored suit modest against the grandeur of government. Beside him, Imani perched on a cushioned bench, clutching Aubrey's pastel quilt in her lap, her small fingers tracing the star patterns as if weaving the past into the future. A somber hush fell when the lead prosecutor cleared his throat. "Gentlemen and ladies of the jury, today's evidence is irrefutable." The senator's gavel echoed, punctuating each indictment. Charges of unlawful human experimentation, trafficking, and conspiracy. As the witness roster unfurled, survivors, once codenamed Gem and Orion, stood to testify with voices steadier than steel. Imani watched each disclosure, her breathing even, her presence a testament to resilience. Graham recalled the moment the first indictment had reached his desk, a flood of emotions, from vindication to sorrow for every life scarred. He closed his eyes briefly as the senator turned to him. Rising, he spoke with calm authority. "I stand not only in memory of my daughter, but in honor of every child who was silenced by these crimes. Let this hearing be their legacy." Applause rippled through the chamber. Imani glanced up at her father, pride and gratitude shining in her wide eyes. She realized then that truth had power, power to dismantle empires built on lies, to give voice to the voiceless, and to forge laws that would protect future generations. Weeks later, Langford Imani Foundation's offices buzzed with purpose. Walls once bare were now lined with children's art, crayon portraits of families, hopeful smiles in bright reds and yellows. Social workers, therapists, and legal advocates passed through corridors designed with low benches and soft carpets, a haven from the world's harshness. In the corner office, Graham and Imani met with the board, approving grants for trauma counseling and safe housing. Every proposal bore their names: Langford for resources restored, Imani for courage reborn. As dusk settled over the city, Graham returned to the secluded garden behind his estate. The marble statue of Aubrey, now adorned with fresh flowers, stood beneath an ancient oak. Imani followed, stepping lightly on the flagstones. Graham retrieved a small bronze plaque and knelt to attach it to the statue's granite base. In memory of all children lost and found, may truth guide our hearts. Imani placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'd like that," she whispered. Graham straightened, voice thick with emotion. She would. Together they stood in the soft glow of lanterns, the oak's leaves rustling like whispered blessings. The night was still, and for the first time since the fire, Graham felt a profound peace. Truth had kindled a legacy, one of justice, compassion, and unbreakable hope, that would outlive them all. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the newly opened Langford Imani Youth Shelter, casting diamond-shaped patches of sun across the tiled floor. Imani stood at the entrance, her hoodie replaced by a bright fitted jacket that matched the shelter's cheerful teal walls. She inhaled the scent of fresh paint and the faint aroma of cinnamon from the kitchen down the hall, a promise of cinnamon rolls to come. A group of children clustered around low tables, coloring posters that read, "You belong here." Their chatter rose in excited peals, plans for after-school clubs, whispered promises to try the climbing wall later. Imani smiled as she wove between them, offering high fives and quiet words of encouragement. Each face she passed held a reflection of her own journey, from unseen shadow to champion of hope. In the art room, she found a shy boy meticulously shading a skyline in blues and purples. Kneeling beside him, Imani traced the rooftops with her finger. "That's beautiful," she said softly. The boy's eyes lit up as his shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time he'd heard praise instead of scolding. Later, in the courtyard, Graham Langford watched from a bench beneath a blossoming magnolia. He brushed fallen petals into the nearby flower beds, an old habit of tending what mattered most. When Imani emerged, she found him smiling, eyes bright with pride. "How's your first day as ambassador?" he asked, rising to envelop her in a hug. She leaned into him, warmth spreading through her. "Amazing. They trust me." Her gaze wandered to the children at play, tag games and hopscotch, laughter echoing against painted murals. "They're not statistics anymore. They're just kids." Graham followed her gaze, heart swelling. "Because of you." She shook her head, tugging a curl free of her jacket collar. "Because we did it together." Inside, the shelter's coordinator, Ms. Alvarez, beckoned them to the resource center. A new batch of donations, books, school supplies, board games, sat neatly on shelves. Imani and Graham spent the afternoon arranging items, cataloging names and needs. Each label, "Anna loves astronomy," "Marcus wants comic books," felt like a promise they intended to keep. As dusk settled, they walked the perimeter garden, where bulbs of lavender and daisies swayed in the gentle breeze. Lanterns glowed along the path, guiding them toward a small plaque engraved with Imani's name, "For those who dream in shadows, may you always find light." Imani traced the letters with her finger, a private smile lighting her face. Graham slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Your tomorrow is just beginning," he said. Imani looked up at the night sky, where the first stars shimmered. In their soft glow, She saw every child she'd helped, every secret she'd shared, and every promise that lay ahead. Tonight the world felt vast but safe, an open canvas waiting for new stories. And as the lanterns flickered around them, Imani whispered, "Let's fill it with every color we've ever known." Night draped itself gently over the Langford estate as Graham Langford and Imani emerged into the quiet sanctuary of the garden. Lanterns glowed along the flagstone path, their light dancing on dew-kissed petals. The marble statue of Aubrey stood at the garden's heart, bathed in soft moonlight, her likeness captured forever in stone. Graham paused before the statue, his breath fogging in the cool air. He knelt, fingertips brushing the engraved base. "In memory of all children lost and found, may truth guide our hearts." Above, Aubrey's face was serene, her eyes turned toward the heavens. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every promise he'd made and every vow he would keep. Imani joined him silently, her small hand slipping into his. Together they stood and looked upward, where stars glittered like distant lanterns. A warm breeze stirred the branches of the ancient oak, showering them in drifting blossoms, as though the night itself celebrated their journey. Graham drew Imani close, voice hushed. "I promised you I'd find the truth. But this," he gestured around them, "this is more than I ever could have imagined." His gaze settled on the statue. Aubrey would have loved the shelter, the laughter, the garden. She would have grown up here, under these stars. Imani rested her head against his shoulder. "She is here," she said softly. "In every child who smiles again, in every room we fill with light." He lifted her chin, meeting her eyes. "And I promise you both this. As long as I draw breath, I will protect every child who needs it. I will fight for truth, no matter how deep the darkness." Above them, a lone owl called into the night. Graham inhaled, drawing strength from the world's hush. He straightened, slipping a folded letter from his pocket. It bore Aubrey's handwriting from years ago. "Daddy, I love you to the stars." He placed it at the statue's feet and laid the melted charm atop it, a circle completed between past and present. Imani watched the letter flutter in the breeze, tears of quiet joy shining in her eyes. She whispered, "Sleep well, Aubrey." A gentle peace embraced them as father and daughter stood together, the fractured pieces of their lives now woven into something whole. Lantern light softened their silhouettes, and the camera of memory panned from the statue's upturned gaze to the wide starlit sky. In that stillness, a new chapter began, one written by hope, compassion, and an unbreakable promise.